All right, let's bring in Andy McCarthy, former federal prosecutor and Fox News contributor, and Kerri Urbahn, Fox News legal editor. Andy, let me start with you. It's interesting that they have continued these flights. I believe another plane went earlier this week to El Salvador, except that the State Department is saying that they did not remove them under the Alien Enemies Act this time. They did it using the traditional the traditional legal authority to enforce immigration laws, which is pretty much what you said they should have done in the first round, right?
Well, it's also, Martha, what Judge Boasberg has said. I don't think, Boasberg is a left of center guy, but I think he's not a bad judge, and he's certainly not a lunatic. And one of the things he said was that since in either event you would have to prove to some level of satisfaction that these guys are members of Tren de Aragua, if you do it under the ordinary immigration laws, the administration has already labeled them or designated Tren de Aragua as a foreign terrorist organization. Right. So that would be unimpeachable, whereas the Alien Enemies Act, I think, has a lot of legal hurdles and complications that may be problematic.
So, Kerri, the order that is being discussed right now is whether or not he defied them, whether or not the Trump White House and the DOJ defied the order of this judge. It's not really about the underlying question of whether or not removing these suspected TDA individuals violated, was a misuse of that law.
Yeah, that's right. And I think this is going to come down to the oral order versus the written order. And what I'm about to say, I know that Andy disagrees with me, but I'm going to go via the Mark Levin school of thought on this and go back to the case that he litigated in 2003, which is the DC district here, federal court that Judge Boasberg is presiding over, that says, that underscores the need for a written order, that an injunction is an injunction when it's written. And the reason this matters is because the fight really comes down to when Judge Boasberg verbally directed them to turn those planes around. He then gave them a break. I think he thought they were going to go make a phone call and interrupt this national security operation. Apparently they didn't. They waited for the written order, and at that point, those planes were long gone. DOJ is doubling down on this written aspect and saying, look, we didn't defy anything because your written order came after we already did this. And so it'll be interesting to see where they land on all of this. I will say I think Judge Boasberg is pretty determined, though, to find them in violation of this order. So I don't see much hope for them with him.
Yeah, he's, saying things like, I can't believe you acted the way you did in this court hearing right now. So he's clearly ticked off that he thinks that the planes may have not left by the time he put this order down. J.D. Vance, the vice president, basically says, we're not going to ask for permission. Watch this.
We do not ask permission from far-left Democrats before we deport illegal immigrants. We do the American people's business. And again, for the American people who are watching, this is such a weird, mistaken placement of priorities. We need to make our country stronger. We need to create jobs. We need to make our streets safer.
Andy, your reaction to that?
Well, I just think, the politics is overwhelming the law here. No one is saying they can't deport these people. Nobody is saying that. But in the United States, we have due process of law, right? When I prosecuted foreign terrorists who all in the end ended up, well, most of them getting life sentences, I couldn't say to the agent, go arrest them, and instead of bringing them to court, put them on a plane and take them to a third country. We have laws about how the process that you have to go through in order to obtain that outcome. And there's two things the courts are very clear on here. One is the courts are going to defer to the political branches about who gets to be in this country and who doesn't get to be in this country. They're going to have a lot of running room on that, but you have to comply with the due process. They're very clear on that.
So, Kerri, in your mind, has the DOJ now decided that they're going to go at this a slightly different way, as Andy in part suggests there, and remove these people under the law that says, they're illegal, they're part of a terrorist organization, and they believe they can substantiate that. And since their country doesn't want them back, we're sending them to El Salvador under agreement with that country?
Well, I think they already have adjusted temporarily in the meantime, which we saw with them deporting those folks under the normal traditional immigration laws. Look, I think their strategy up until this point with respect to immigration is let's throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. It's what we're seeing with birthright citizenship. I mean, they've lost all of that so far, but they knew that going in because they're just trying to get that issue before the Supreme Court. With respect to the Alien Enemies Act, I think the reason they did it was because it's fast. and it doesn't require the same exact process as, or really the same process at all as these other laws require, but it does, to Andy's point, require something. So what is that something exactly? And I think, look, I think the Trump administration is, in some ways, again, seeing what works, and maybe they'll pull back as it doesn't. But in the meantime, I think they're dealing with a pretty frustrated judge.
Yeah. I think that they have decided politically that they want to fulfill the promises that were made on the campaign trail, and they're going to keep doing that. I think it's a basic theory of it's easier to ask forgiveness than permission at this point, and they're plowing forward, and they're hoping, as Kerri says, that some of these things that end up in the Supreme Court, and they'll see what happens then. Kerri and Andy, thank you both so much. Always good to see you.
Thank you.
So
click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You won't get it anywhere else.